How does saturated fat impact death from heart disease in the French or the trend in other countries as well?
Well, this is remarkable because I'm an outsider to this field. It's almost as I'm looking in on a field that has been hijacked by horrid science. I mean, I'm appalled when I look at nutrition science from as an outsider. And again, I bring up Ansel Keys. Ansel Keys, again, was a person who in the 1950s gained so much acclaim because he was a self-described expert in heart disease and diet. Ansel Keys decided that saturated fat was the cause of heart disease in the complete absence of any evidence. And there has not been any evidence that saturated fat alone contributes to heart disease. Now, when you ask people, what do you eat? And they'll tell you, well, I eat cheeseburger, French fries, ice cream, and soda. Somehow Ansel Keys only heard cheeseburger. And from that, he didn't even get that a cheeseburger usually has bread with it. And he didn't care that people were drinking soda and eating lots of sugar and eating candy. He focused on the saturated fat, which is found in the meat. And that's what so many other epidemiologists have done. They focus on the fact that there are individuals who do eat a lot of meat, and the people who eat the most meat in Western civilization also tend to eat the most sugar. And that combination is unhealthy. It's pretty obvious. But there have been some great studies that have come out. Zoe Harcombe is one whose PhD work was to actually evaluate the studies that were available when Ansel Keys was around and since then. And you've got so many individuals now that have then taken a close look at saturated fat per se, specifically animal fat. And when you separate the sugar component, when you separate the carbohydrate component from the fat, what you see is that there is no association between saturated fat consumption and heart disease. For example, I mean, what's been so demonized, what I was afraid of 20 years ago, was consuming eggs. I mean, eggs are loaded with saturated fat and cholesterol. And so people are afraid to eat eggs. And as it turns out, eggs actually raise HDL, which is a good thing. Eggs don't actually have any much of an effect on total cholesterol. But ultimately, it's one of the healthiest foods that a person can eat, is to have eggs. So this is part of the misinformation we've been given as far as diet and health.
Absolutely. And I recall Dr. Harcombe giving a presentation where she points out the amount of saturated fat in 100 grams of almonds being much more so than in 100 grams of a steak. And so some of these things that people just take for granted and don't get into the details because, of course, we're consuming all types of fats in the foods that we eat. And
well, that's a misunderstanding, which I think has been promoted in part by the food industry. And so they want to sell the low-fat food and people want to promote certain foods. But part of this is also philosophy. I don't think this is all just about profiteering. I mean, there's a powerful vegan movement which wants to demonize meat simply because they just think it's wrong, and they like to point to epidemiological studies in which you have people who, again, are eating a lot of meat and smoking and eating a lot of sugar who have poor health, and they seem to put blinders on to ignore the smoking and the sugar component. So part of this is dealing with individuals who have a philosophical objection to the consumption of meat, and they influence in how people think about consuming meat.
oh, for sure. And, the discussion on obviously total cholesterol seems to have passed a little bit, obviously, in big pharma as well as even in doctors' offices of moving away from that. The conversation now, which, we're having around saturated fat, and the evidence that you point to is obviously highlighting the fact that it's not dangerous for folks, especially if they're getting this from real food. Yet there's still, a decent amount of experts and others out there who are skeptical about raising the levels of saturated fat in one's diet and do believe that it should be replaced by polyunsaturated fats. Can you maybe speak to some of what you believe their reasons might be and some of the shortcomings there?
Yeah, so again, you mentioned before the French, and you had spent some time in France, and I've been to France numerous times, and it's remarkable to me that Ansel Keys completely ignored the French diet. He ignored the Swiss diet, which is also very high in fat in general and saturated fat. In fact, France has the highest percentage of fat in the calories of any European nation, and the highest percentage of saturated fat for total calories. And you actually can see in nutrition journals, it's been shown that the French had the lowest rate of heart disease of any country in Europe, and certainly much lower than that in the US. And what's happened is people just are choosing to ignore it. And I've never seen in science, I've been in science 40 years, I have never seen any other area that uses the word paradox more often than the nutrition area. I mean, in every other area of science, when you have data that are contrary to the hypothesis, you change the hypothesis. You don't just call the data a paradox. And only in nutrition do they just continually call something a paradox. So what you have is the French paradox. And you see these people, Walter Willett, Ansel Keys, who scratch their heads and say, I just don't get it. How can the French eat so much fat and not have heart disease? And then they call it the French paradox. Now what they'll do is they'll say, well, the French doctors don't know how to diagnose heart disease, which is absolutely absurd. To say, well, they don't even know what heart disease looks like. But the other thing that's so clear, you've been in France. Anyone who goes to France knows that these people are so terribly thin. Obesity is so rare in France. And it's for two reasons. When you eat a higher percentage of food as fat, you actually feel more full, and you actually ultimately consume fewer calories. And so that's a really great thing about a higher fat, low carb diet, is it triggers the sort of natural hormonal response, which then produces satiety. And part of the reason why low carb diet is effective is because you actually consume fewer calories and you don't have those big swings in blood sugar. The science is entirely on the side of high fat in the context of a low carb diet is extraordinarily healthy. I've also lectured and covered how when you include fat in your meal, you're much more effective at absorbing nutrients, much more effective at absorbing antioxidants and minerals. And by actually, frankly, having more fat, and this will surprise people, by reducing the plants in your diet, you have more efficient absorption of minerals. And this I credit Georgia Ede, especially for a lecture she's given that I've seen, in which you can see that plants actually have what's called anti-nutrients, phytates and lectins that can interfere with absorption of minerals. So ultimately, it's really, the irony is that one of the healthiest foods you can eat is basically animal products, whether it's meat or the organs. They are the ideal food one wants to have if you want to optimize nutrient absorption and overall health.
Yeah, it's definitely something that in France, as well as all over Europe, of eating nose to tail and consuming real meat and the whole animal and organ meats is part of the diet. And of course, in places like North America, Canada, the US, even the UK, over 50% of the households purchasing on food is on processed and ultra processed food. And when you go to places like France, it's like 18% or 16% in Spain and 12% in Italy. So you can see that, as you mentioned, just getting back to real food and having that approach is pretty key. Now, if we talk about and shift gears a little bit to statins, as they're sort of obviously the gold standard approach to treating high cholesterol or high LDL levels, can you talk a bit about some of the original research on statins like Lipitor and Crestor?
Okay. So before we get into the statins, I would like to briefly cover another category of medication, which is as effective as the statins in lowering LDL, but in addition raises HDL, and that's the CETP inhibitors. And what they do is they interfere with the conversion of HDL into LDL. The result is that you've got elevated HDL, which is called the good cholesterol, because higher HDL is associated with less heart disease. And at the same time, it lowers LDL as effectively as the statins. And the results are absolutely clear. Here it is 20 years later. Tens of thousands of people have been tested in multiple trials. Drug companies have spent billions on what should have been a blockbuster drug. And there's absolutely no difference whatsoever with the people with lower LDL with the CETP inhibitors compared to the placebo. And so to me, that right there tells you that lowering LDL does not have any benefit whatsoever on coronary events. That leads us now to the statins, which are the HMG-CoA reductase inhibitors, acting by a different mechanism in which you block statin production, or block you block cholesterol production directly with the enzyme that is in the pathway of producing cholesterol. So it's a different mechanism from the CETP inhibitors. And the statins have side effects, pleiotropic effects, in which statins also have an anticoagulant and anti-inflammatory effects. So it's in a sense much dirtier, having more side effects than the CETP inhibitors. Mm-hmm. And with the statins, what you do find is a relatively small improvement in outcomes. Those outcomes actually were relatively large in the first couple of studies. And you have the 4S, which I do simvastatin study, which is in the 1990s. This is the largest effect probably ever published, in which people were given simvastatin, and you had about a 4% reduction in coronary events and mortality. And this is a study that's never been replicated. It was designed, run, data were entirely analyzed by the drug companies. And frankly, no one should believe those findings. They have not been replicated. The more recent studies have shown maybe when there is an effect, it's about a 1% benefit when you compare people taking the statins versus placebo. And even then, you're only talking about coronary events. You're not really looking at coronary mortality. Absolutely no benefit whatsoever when you're looking at primary treatment, which is for people who have never had a coronary events, and about a 1% to 2% benefit for people who have already had a heart attack. So the real effects, I think people don't know, is when a doctor says, well, we're going to reduce the likelihood you're going to have a heart attack with a statin, they really should know that that difference is only 1% different from someone who takes nothing, takes a placebo, which means that 1% means that only 1 out of every 100 people using Lipitor or Crestor, only 1 person will have 1 less heart attack over the course of about 4 years. So the benefit really is meager with the statins.